I'm Emily Pawley, and I'm excited to talk today about my book, The Nature of the Future, Agriculture, Science, and Capitalism in the Antebellum North, which just came out a few days ago from Chicago. I really want to thank Lindsay Chervinsky for making this gathering of books and ideas possible, and I'm excited to see the other talks. Rather than summarize the book, I thought I'd talk generally about the phenomenon that I'm studying, agricultural improvement, and the big questions that I have. And at some point, I'll come around to explaining why I have a giant chicken on the cover of the book. I'm an environmental historian, and my background is the history of science. So I'm interested in how people interact with a living landscape and how they produce knowledge about it. In general, historians of 19th century science have tended to study the wild living landscape, the world of what we call natural history, the naming and discovery of new species and the rise of evolutionary theory and the expansion of empire. And that's where I started as a historian of science. But in the 19th century US, wild spaces are not most people's closest connection with animals and plants. Most people know sea anemones or mountain lions or finches through pictures that they're getting in books. In the 19th century, most people in the US and in a lot of the world managed small ecosystems for a living. That is, they farmed. So when I say they managed ecosystems, that means they kept dozens of animal and plant species alive, and they created hospitable environments for them. They fed them, quite often to each other. They organized their reproduction, and they killed them, and they sold them. So there's actually a lot of action that creates this peaceful looking scene. I'm interested in the kind of knowledge that comes from these very intimate encounters. These are encounters which are, in the US, increasingly shaped by the expansion of new markets, and I'm interested in the effects of that expansion. And to get at these things, I focus on a globally important set of ideas and practices that was called agricultural improvement. So what was agricultural improvement? It was a set of practices and a network of texts and institutions that got started by wealthy landlords in 18th century Britain, who were looking for ways to make their landscapes more profitable through new knowledge and new forms of control. It got picked up by British colonial officials, and it became a global phenomenon. And in the colonial period, it also gets picked up by Americans, who think of themselves as members of the gentry analogous to their counterparts in Britain. So that includes Southern planters, including quite famous ones like Washington and Jefferson, but also Boston merchants. And in New York, my area of focus, these major, wealthy, developmentally minded, land speculating landlords, people like the Rensselaers and the Livingstons, who own whole counties on the Upper Hudson. For its first few decades in the United States, improvement is kind of the possession of the American gentry, but it is not at this time hugely successful. However, after the Panic of 1837, agricultural improvement gets a huge boost from state legislatures, which start to reliably fund state and county agricultural societies. These societies are much more diverse. They have a much bigger range of incomes. They have a much kind of broader set of goals. They're a bigger coalition. Members of these societies meet annually at state and county fairs that become huge public spectacles. Hundreds of thousands of people come to them. One of the things I like about both of these images actually is that they're both really images of the crowd, particularly the one in the bottom, which says it's the cattle show, but there are no visible cattle. It's just little tiny heads. Improvers also read agricultural journals. There are many, many, many of them. I have an ad for one on the left, and they're quite prominent. More than one agricultural journal editor becomes governor of his state. And Jesse Buell, the editor of The Cultivator, runs for governor of New York. Members of these societies are not just expected to read. They're also expected to make knowledge. They have a culture of experiment and public trial and exhibition. And this is important, increasingly they buy goods from a growing commercial network of warehouses and manufacturers and nurserymen who sell goods that transform landscapes. So there are new machines, new fertilizers, new organisms. These warehouses don't just sell those things, though. They also sell books and journals. And they cast themselves as museums and places of learning and experiment. So one of the things I'm trying to do here is expand the number of places where we see science happening in the early republic. I focus on New York State because it's the largest center of American improvement in the antebellum period, Partly also because it starts to dominate these commercial markets because of its position between Midwestern and coastal markets. Also, because it's an agricultural powerhouse throughout this period, it's a place where a lot of new things are being tried out, and it's also the places with the biggest state science budgets in the nation, like much bigger than any other state, and that's because of the Erie Canal profits. By the 1860s, there were more than 900 agricultural societies in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people were attending fairs and reading journals, and by the 1860s, agricultural improvement was the largest and most active, self-consciously scientific community in the United States. After the Civil War, once improvers get more federal support, they'll shape the agenda of a new scientific infrastructure of land-grant colleges and experiment stations that will essentially create our modern industrial agriculture. And they will also shape the alternatives to that system. So organic and alternative farming advocates will look back to the practices of the early 19th century as models, and they're going to call them traditional. So they have quite concrete consequences, not just in their own time. So when I say that improvement is a set of scientific practices, what do I mean? Partly, improvers are using things that we recognize as science. There are lots of different sciences, in fact, because farms are pretty complicated objects of knowledge. So there's entomology and soil science, or, as we see in this picture, being handed down by God, chemistry, geology, botany, and meteorology. And we see that actually agriculture is on this list of sciences of agriculture. But improvement also has some general features that hold together its different investigations. For one thing, and this is where my title comes from, improving science is futuristic. Okay, so what does that mean? We're not used to thinking of farming as futuristic. After a few decades, actually, everything in farming gets labeled traditional, kind of no matter what. Let me explain it this way. In a lot of sciences, the job of the scientist is to describe the world as it is. So naturalists are going out into the world to find out what is there, to collect species and to bring them home. Geologists are mapping existing strata of rock. These are sciences of inventory, looking at what is here in the world with us now. But agricultural science is about landscapes that are not there yet. So for improvers, the future is what they are looking at. Looking at the granite forested slopes of the Adirondacks, for example, the improving scientist Ebenezer Emmons said that he could hear the cattle who would one day graze there. And that's a very common kind of thing for an improver to say. Describing a particularly beautiful variety of apple, like this red astrakhan, improvers were not describing an existing population of trees. They were trying to create one by recruiting buyers for their varieties, by moving them through the network of warehouses and nurseries. Where naturalists looked for divine creations in wild species, improvers planned a world that they would help to co-create. But that didn't mean that this improving world was not, to them, natural. I want to draw your attention to the hand holding the scroll full of sciences, right? Improvers imagined a God who worked through the economy, a God who had anticipated the arrival of white people in New York and who had prepared the landscape for them. So good wheat land in one place, good cheese country in another. What a convenient crease for the Erie Canal. This is also a God who expected improvers to violently clear Haudenosaunee people from upstate New York, which is something that a lot of improvers are trying to do throughout this period because many of them are land speculators and they're actively engaged. Their experiments and their prizes and their observations claim to find the signs that God has left about the shape of this future economy. This also means that they have kind of an unusual way of looking at animals and plants. When they see a weird pig, they don't think, an anomaly, let us find a normal pig so that we can describe what pigs look like. They look at the weird pig, like this weird pig, to see if maybe it should be bred from, to reshape the future of pigs. There's actually a genre of writing and display of surprisingly large animals and plants. I call them agricultural giants. So these are like really big strawberries or like melons that are 6 feet around or oxen. Looking at them, improvers can see the cultivation and skill that went into them, and that's partly what they're admiring, but they also see an extension of the realm of agricultural possibility. So the image on the cover of my book is from a humorous book written after an enthusiasm for very tall Chinese chickens in the 1850s. It's obviously a joke of scale, like a fish story, But the thing with improving knowledge is it's never fully clear what's a fish story and what's a surprising reality. The boundaries of credible reality are constantly being pushed in agriculture. And in fact, what's tall tale one decade in terms of size or shape or a yield, right, can be normal the next. Okay, now just a few general points about this style of knowing. We sometimes talk in the history of science about the rise of disinterested expertise that is separated from money. And improving experiments, partly because the economy is supposed to be a natural phenomenon, profit is part of the proof. They often finish their experiments with accounts showing that their experiment was profitable. And they also imagine particular parts of the landscape as being in financial relationships with them. I particularly like this image, which describes the debtor-creditor relationships of a manure pile right next to the debtor-creditor relationships of a human being. And this is from an improving accounting textbook. We also sometimes talk about capitalism as a kind of rationalizing force. So science provides capitalism with a set of stable values, with some kind of certainty. And I want to be clear, that does not happen in improvement. Improving science fuels the same bubbles and volatility and questions about what value means that the rest of the antebellum economy is racked by. And you can see this in this picture of bubbles, which I really enjoy. So purebred chickens and cattle and dwarf pear trees are mixed in with second mortgages and railroad shares and paper money, and I notice female novelists. I spend quite a lot of time on one really big bubble, the mulberry mania of 1838, when mulberry trees become hot speculative commodities across the country because they're expected to feed the silkworms of a new silk empire. So New York is going to be like China, and this is going to rescue investors from the Panic of 1837. There are actually quite a lot of moments like this, and they tend to get isolated from the rest of the history of agricultural capitalism as kind of moments of mania. And actually, I think that they are pretty normal and they're pretty integral to the process as a whole. Also, like the rest of antebellum market culture, improvement is full of frauds and counterfeits and people who are accusing each other of fraud and counterfeit. And this is amplified by the fact that a lot of the most important voices in this set of sciences are themselves selling products in the agricultural warehouses. So they might have a particular theory of how fertility works that goes with a particular kind of fertilizer, or they might have a perception of flavor that matches the fruit trees they happen to have in stock. I really want the messiness of this to come through. No one is fully able to capture the meaning and the voices of improvement, right? It's always kind of a clamoring set. Okay, kind of couple final thoughts. The recent history of American capitalism has helped us look to the South and to slavery to find the origins of industrialization and capitalism and the violent foundations of America's wealth. And I think that turn is really important. But I think in making that turn, we maybe let the North turn into a bit of an anti-capitalist foil, particularly the rural North, a place where agriculture stays traditional and where white families are presumed to be maintaining their traditional forms of knowledge. And this is maybe supported by the expanding modern local food movement, which has a kind of a nostalgia problem fantasizing about this period. So, for example, all the new fruit varieties that are being pushed through consumer markets as total novelties in the 1840s and transforming environments are now heirlooms, which is a fully sentimental non-commodity. I also sometimes think we've left farming as one of the last bastions where markets seem obvious and rational. And we sort of imagine that farmers are just solidly reading markets somehow, or just obeying their dictates, right? They just see good dairy land and they respond to urban demand for dairy, and suddenly there's a dairy region. This puzzle, which I had as a child, and which you might also have had as a child, this puzzle feels like a natural map somehow, even though it's a fundamentally created ecosystem. Improvers have done a good job, actually, of making it seem like cows belong in the dairy places. I think that's quite dangerous. The signals of the landscape are not clear. They're not unitary. Farmers are telling stories and reading conflicting signals like anyone else. I think that's particularly important right now because we're headed into a period of enormous landscape restructuring as the climate changes. And if we believe that the landscape itself dictates the kind of system built on it, if we kind of uncritically accept the stories of the agricultural future that we're given, we will give up our agency to make decisions about social systems and food systems that we build on the land. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I look forward to seeing you all on Twitter.